Welcome to My Counselor Live. I'm Tori, and today I'm joined by another one of our great counselors here at MCO. This is Alyssa, and we get to just chat today, hear from her, hear her heart for what she does, and really just like come together and learn together. So this is going to be awesome. Alyssa, I would love for you to just take a second and introduce yourself to those listening that maybe don't know who you are.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Like Tori said, my name is Alyssa Bostwick. I'm a licensed clinical social worker here at MCO. Oh, I'm about to reach my 1 year anniversary at the company, and I've been practicing as a therapist for the past 5 years. So just some big anniversaries coming up, and I love this company. I don't say that because I'm on video. I truly believe it, which we might actually get into a little bit with some of our discussions today. But I want you guys to know a little bit about me. And again, I'm a therapist. What does that mean? Who really cares? Whatever. But you're going to know that I'm super transparent. You'll always know what I'm thinking. And I love people and I love Jesus. And so in this conversation, I hope that comes across to you. I can be really sassy and lose my filter, which is great. And, I think as we dive into some of these topics, I just want everybody to know, like, I'm going to have fun. Tori, you and I always have fun together. So I really want our viewers to have fun as we dive into some hard topics that might be a little challenging to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. We do always have fun. And you know what? I love when you go off filter. I think it makes things fun. It makes it genuine and exciting, and I love it. So I am excited to just talk today and dive in. We're going to start by kind of talking through one of your articles that you wrote. We always kind of start our lives off with this, and I think it's a really cool way for our viewers to get to know the counselor and things that they're passionate about. And so this article is really about trauma. But it's called Do I Matter? A question that tells the story of emotional abuse and little t trauma. So, to start us off, why did you write this article and who did you write it to?
Yes. Why did I write this article? I actually wrote this article because this question, do I matter, is one that is in my office often. And as I was thinking about kind of what article do I want to write, there's so many different kinds of topics that we address as therapists because we're practicing here at MCO. We cover so many different presenting issues, and our doors are always wide open. And so with that, you never know what's going to be sitting on your couch. So I found it so interesting that so many people ask that question, do I matter? And as I've sat with clients and we've dove into that topic, the biggest thing that came up was emotional abuse and little t trauma, which we'll define in a little bit. But I think as we kind of dive into this, I want everybody to know, do I matter is a question that so many people ask. And I even included in my article a funny picture from a movie that I like with Hitch with Will Smith. And I love this movie because I think it kind of puts this question into frame for us. Because do I matter builds this picture. I think most of us kind of stereotypically think of people who struggle in life, the people who don't really connect with others, who might struggle with friendships, or who are kind of the loners, right? Or who might not be the most attractive people or whatever, right? As we have this stigma that pops up when we think of this question. And that is a stigma that I just want to blast and punch in the face and say, no, there's so many people who ask this question, and it's any of us, it's all of us. And so really allowing anybody who's watching this to know that there's nothing wrong with you. It's not like because you're a nerd or anything. I'm a nerd. I read a lot. I do jigsaw puzzles in my free time. So welcome to the nerd club. But yeah, I think this is a question that many of us ask.
So, why might someone be wondering, do I matter? Why does that question even come up in the first place?
Yeah, it is a question that is one of those soul aching questions. For you to wonder, do I matter? I'm putting myself into that place right now as I think, where would I have to be to ask that question? Do I matter? Oh, And I really can only empathize and feel it to my core, because this is a question that people wonder about, because they feel it. They feel it to the middle of who they are. It's an identity question. Do I matter? Right? If you think about asking yourself that question, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot who's watching, but do I matter is usually one of those ones that come with a lot of tears, with a lot of heartache, a lot of anger. And it's a question that doesn't just pop into their brains. It's a question that they have carried with them for a lifetime. Right? So usually, and I see people who, my teenagers are in this room with me, or the young adults, but I also have the grandmas and the grandpas and the parents. And every generation of clients that I see, right, whole span of life, has sat in this room and have asked me the same question. Do I matter? And to think about wondering about that, to think to yourself, do I matter? It is very much, it's to the core of who you are. There's a sense that you don't, and that's why you ask it.
That's good. Yeah. And I mean, it's hard. I mean, I feel like I have found myself asking that question before. And you kind of like lead it back to trauma. So I would love if you could just go ahead and define just generally, like, what is trauma?
I said this in one of our last videos, Tori, and so I don't want to be repetitive, but I think that I still hold to it. It's just part of who I am.
Hey, there's some people who are tuning in who weren't here last time. So
Yeah.
say it again, go for it.
Or you're just going to get an Alyssa-ism and you're going to quote me for life.
Right. Yeah.
Find out.
We love it.
To define trauma, it's really dependent on who you are. And I think as clinicians, I can go with the textbook answer. I don't really like in this space, as I'm sitting with clients who say, do I matter? Textbook answers aren't going to fix anything. And so when I think about trauma, I think about it's completely up to your experience, and you are the only one who gets to tell me if it was traumatic or not. Right? We have people who've been in car accidents, or who survived Hurricane Katrina, or who have been in COVID and are working in the hospitals and seeing people die every day, right? As I sit with you, it completely depends on your story and your experience to tell me if it was traumatic or not. Right? I have a twin sister. I don't know if most people know this about me, but her and I will sit down and I'll say, Jen, her name's Jen. I'll say, Jen, when we went through that as kids, I was messed up for life. And she's over there like, I don't even remember what you're talking about. Right? So our personalities play a role with this, kind of our own temperaments, developmental stages. And so to define trauma, I really would rather push in and ask you, do you think what you went through is traumatic? With that said, Tori, I'm pretty sure you're going to get specific and ask me to give examples of what like little T and emotional trauma is. So I'll go into a textbook answer, because I think knowledge sets us free. The truth sets us free. Very much how Christ feels. And so it's both of those things. Is I can look at the general definitions, but I want to free people up to say, no, what I went through sucked.
Yeah, that's so good. That's hard. I mean, for sure. It's a hard thing to define, I feel like, because it can only really be defined by the people who are experiencing it. Things that were traumatic to me, that people did to me, their intention may not have been to cause me trauma, but it caused me trauma, and I decide that.
Yeah,
Which is actually kind of freeing too, that there's not really a bound of like, okay, I didn't experience trauma unless this happened. It's kind of freeing to be able to just say, no, this really affected me, and I believe it was traumatic toward me. That's freeing, because that's the beginning of beginning to process, that is accepting that you experienced that.
Yes. And oftentimes not how we're treated in relationships, because intention is considered so much, that intention weighs more than the impact it had. And so I think I just want our viewers to know, when you walk into therapy, it's not my job to tell you right, wrong, left, right. My job is to understand your experience and give you voice. And I think a lot of people need that.
Yeah. Yeah. So little T trauma, go into it. What is that? How do we compare little T trauma to just trauma?
Yeah. So I'm going to go in reverse of that. Big T trauma would be what we think when we think about the clinical definition of trauma. This would be your big sexual abuse, the physical abuse, any kind of neglect, the things that you think of when you think of trauma, the things that we really see like in the movies, those really big moments.
Right. And I think trauma was kind of defined during post-war, like as PTSD, that kind of thing. Those big, huge things affected someone. Yeah.
And some people, as we go through this, big T trauma can cause the effect in us to ask the question, do I matter? So I don't want to disqualify that experience from this conversation, but just giving voice, and like Tori, like you said, I want to set people free to understand and have this experience of relief from watching this video and reading this article. So that's why I focus on little T trauma. Little T trauma are the things that people, when you're living it, don't necessarily recognize it as traumatic. Right. So I have a couple clients, and I use this example with them is growing up, you might have had mom and dad who were married, who were middle class, who provided for you. You always had food on the table. It was the American dream, 2.5 kids, which I never understand the half, dog, white picket fence, right? You always got a ride to school, and you had money in the bank as like tuition for college, right? Looks like you got it all, right? But at home, nobody asks you how your day was and what's going on with your best friend who you don't talk to anymore, or why you just go down the hall and slam your door and you don't come out for hours, right? That emotional engagement is missing, right? We call it attunement, is that moms and dads, right, usually know when something's wrong. Usually, I say usually because this would be a little T trauma, is when parents miss a tune. They don't know something's wrong, so they don't know to ask, right? And this isn't because of blame or it's their fault. It might just be they work really hard and they're not always there.
Yeah, my next question was going to be, how do parents, guardians, loved ones, how can they, I guess, affect that little T trauma? How can they cause that? What role do parents really play in that like future realization that like, oh, I experienced this?
Yeah. When I look at a parent, they're Sue Johnson, who's one of the creators of therapy we use. She describes it as being accessible, responsive, and engaged. Were your parents accessible? Were you able to reach out? Were they there for you? Were they responsive, right? You've got the parents who've got flat affect, which is totally okay, right? We've got all of the resting mean faces, right, in the world. And, those are okay. It's not about changing who you are. It's about responding to your kid when they need something, right? When they fall out of the tree in the backyard and they're yelling, that you come running to check in on them and make sure they didn't break a bone, right? You respond to them. The other piece is this emotional engagement. Is that, right, Tori, as you would tell me something that's going on, you'd have my full attention. I'd be fully engaged with you, right? And it's a felt sense, right? It's how the child feels and experiences mom and dad. Were they available? And so thinking about those things, there's a lot of flexibility in this too, right? I think about the new moms who might have the screaming baby and the older siblings like, okay, well, I'm gonna just go make a peanut butter and jelly because mom's too busy, right? Like there's flexibility and resiliency inside of us. But really, when I look at little T trauma, I could talk about this all day long. Without those ARE, without those three things, people feel desperately alone. Do I matter?
Yeah, and that's a hard question to be asking when you're a child, really. You don't even realize that you may be asking that question.
You might not even realize you've been asking it for years. And you might be sitting on my couch after a breakup and you thought you were going to marry this person and you are falling apart, right? And you're asking, do I matter? Do I matter? Do I matter? And as we dig into it further, it goes beyond that breakup. It goes beyond the marriage infidelity. It goes beyond a divorce or a lost loved one. And it goes into, oh my goodness, you have been asking this question your whole entire life.
That's so good. Yeah. Yeah. So if someone is tuning in today, they've been asking, do I matter? Maybe they're just now realizing that they've been asking that question for years. What do you recommend that we do about that?
Yeah. I put this in my article. There's like three things that I really encourage people to do. I, you know, I always put a nugget of therapy in there. I truly believe in therapy as somebody who's been in it myself. Um, right? Even being forced by my mother when I was a child and I was so mean. I called my therapist. I told my mom, I was like, she looks like a dinosaur from the land before time. And, like the things that we say as kids, but therapy saved my life. And so I say that as a person myself, but also a therapist, is to have somebody, because in the middle of it is emotional neglect. You're not getting what you need. It's just what that means. Sometimes we can't rely and lean on to the people around us because our need might be greater than they're able to supply, especially while we're still healing. And so really leaning into the professionals who know how to meet your need, who know how to be there for you, and who know how to help you heal from trauma. I think that's huge. I also say curiosity and kindness. When we go through traumatic things, usually the first thing we lose is kindness towards ourselves, right? We have less patience, we start judging ourselves, our self esteem decreases. And so, really practicing some self compassion, I think that's huge. The last thing I said is finding loving people, right? So, this isn't necessarily getting your needs met like in a one other person, because we can't do that except for through Jesus. But God puts people into our lives that actually can be healing towards us. This would be like an a spiritual mother, a spiritual father, a spiritual older, wiser other, right? And Cloud and Townsend are some psychologists who are here in the US, and most people know them because of their book called Boundaries. They wrote a book called Our Mother Ourselves. And this book is can be really intense, and it looks at little t trauma. It looks at the attachment we have with our moms, but they so gently write it at the very beginning before you dive into all of that stuff of, hey, you might have gone through some things in this stuff because mom's not perfect. She's not Jesus. No one will ever be perfect. That's okay. That's okay. But God created us to be a redeemed people. And he often redeems our process and our story by bringing people in who can give us the things that we missed as kids. So I always like to encourage that is, the balance of having a helping, wise therapist while finding somebody who can be in your life who can meet those needs. This is going to help you heal the past. This is going to help you get the needs that you've always needed met today.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, for sure. We'll link that book, you guys, in the description for you guys to look into if this is something that's resonating with you. But Alyssa, just kind of to close out the conversation around this article, what's a last piece of encouragement that you would like to give to someone who's tuning in, who is asking that question, who is feeling just the weight of all of that right now?
Yeah. I think back to the phrase of emotional neglect is that feeling of being alone. And I want to encourage just anybody who's watching this that might be on their living room couches or at work right now. If you feel alone, know that there's people who are here to help and who can love you and help take care of you. And that can be a therapist for a time, right? It can be Jesus Christ who died on the cross for your sins, right? There are people and a Jesus out there who's just so ready to embrace you and allow that in. Reach out for help if you need it. And know that the question of do I matter doesn't have to be a question you'll carry for the rest of your life. There can be freedom from that.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us, Alyssa, and just your tenderness and responding to that question. I think that that is so needed for so many people. So thank you. And with that, we are going to jump into the next segment of My Counselor Live, which is our trending topic. What are people researching, talking about, asking questions about? And today we're talking about compassion fatigue. I feel like the definition of that is sort of in what it's called, feeling tired of being compassionate, I guess. But would you go ahead and maybe define that for us? And let's talk a little bit about what it is, maybe why it even happens.
Yeah. So with compassion fatigue, okay, I'm a nerd. I've already told you all of this. So there's different ways people describe it. It can be vicarious trauma, secondary stress disorder, burnout. But if you look at it, it's usually a spectrum, burnout at one end, compassion fatigue at the other. And so as I think about compassion fatigue, it's that process. Historically, it's been medical providers, helpers, right? But right now in the US and the world, compassion fatigue hits us all. It's that process of being faced with people's worst days continuously, right? And not seeing a way out, right? So this is the process of the caretaker. It might be a mom who takes care of her elderly mother, right? It could be a sibling who has a special needs sibling. It could be anything, right? It could just be the fact that your neighbor got COVID and is really sick and lives alone, and you're helping take care of them without, right, being freaked out that you might get sick too, right? Like as we look at this compassion fatigue, I really am not shocked that this is the trending topic because this is the world we live in with COVID this last year. It's the process of feeling exhausted and feeling like there's no fix. It might be like you feel it one day and then it's gone the next. That's why it's on the left side of the spectrum. It's not as severe as a burnout, but it's definitely that process of, will this ever end? Am I making an impact? Is what I'm doing even mattering? Oh, and then you show up and have to take care of somebody.
Yeah, really common feelings, I feel like, from this past year, and everything that's been going on, and really just hitting that burnout of compassion, which sounds so crazy. Like, how could you get tired of being compassionate toward people? But I think, like you said, I feel like it's rooted in you and what you're experiencing. It's not that what they're experiencing isn't valid, isn't important, shouldn't be paid attention to. It's just you aren't caring for yourself in a way that gives you the capacity to be compassionate toward them, which I think is so interesting. So, next question, kind of off of that, is how do we avoid compassion fatigue? What are some practical tips that
Yep.
you would suggest?
Yep. Well, first, I just want to say everybody gets compassion fatigue. I get compassion fatigue. The therapists, the MCO do, doctors do, mothers do, right? Everybody does. And I was actually like thinking about this today when I read the Bible. Sometimes I like to just speed read like a chapter. And then I think about the context of what was that whole chapter about. And Matthew 8 and 9 go through this, is that Jesus is healing multiple people and he keeps turning around and healing more people. Then there's like a demon possessed man, and then the man who needs to be, I don't know, my words have lost me, healed because he can't walk, right? And then the lady with blood touches him and he's not even like consenting, even though Jesus is consenting, he heals her, but she just touches him, right? His own humanity has a limit, right? He's Jesus, he is God, but in his humanity, he pulls Matthew aside, he pulls him in and calls him to serve and become a disciple. And at the end of all of it, he says, the harvest is great and the workers are few. And I just think about that, Tori, as I think about compassion fatigue before we even dive into what do we do about it, is that this is so human. It's not because you've done anything wrong. And I think there's a lot of shame when it comes to compassion fatigue of I must have done something wrong. I'm weak. I'm not good enough. But sometimes it's I'm not doing a great job taking care of myself, or the need is greater than I can give.
It's almost like you need to have some compassion on yourself, you know?
Yes. So I read this article and I forget who wrote it. And I was actually going to try to look it up, but it's going to take too much time. But the author mentioned 5 things that we can do is equip yourself with knowledge, right? As if we can all study compassion fatigue and just read an article and kind of notice it, I think that would decrease like the shame and the guilt that comes up, which then gets in the way of us actually having compassion towards ourselves or getting help. The next piece is the piece that I think all of us go to is good, like coping skills. Yeah, I can cope all day long, right? But are they good? Are they helpful? Are they healthy, right? Are we exercising? Are we spending time with our husbands and our dogs? Are we outside, right? And that I think is the hardest part during COVID is everybody's coping has shifted and looks so different. So continuing to put energy into that, and I know you already feel empty. So it's just trying to figure out pieces that, right, walk outside and just take a walk around your block once or twice a day. Um, the third one is get support, talk about it. Is the more you talk about it, the more you're going to realize you're not the only one. I think we all need to know, again, we need to know we're not alone. And the 2 pieces that this author mentioned, which I think was so beautiful, and I'm going to have to look this up, is this process that we need to know that there's a purpose and a calling in what we've been, like what we're doing. I think that's huge because as I think about it, Jesus Christ called Matthew. Jesus Christ said the workers are few and the harvest is great. And after that, chapter 10, he goes into like giving them the power of the Holy Spirit. He allows them to do the things and operate in the miracles that he's operating in. And so knowing there is a purpose behind the position you stand in, people need you. And to step back and realize that, oh, I'm here because God called me to do this, or I'm here because it matters, right? And to remind ourselves of that. And the last piece is hope. We all need to find hope in what we do. It's not just about bandaging wounds. It's about this process of knowing that what you're doing matters and you are having an impact, even if it's not on a global scale. For that one person, that one day, it really does matter. I think that's hard when we're working with patients that cuss us out and things, might be hard to find some hope there, but just realizing that there is a dent that you're making.
Yeah, that's so encouraging. I feel like that's such a timely message coming out of 2020 and going into this year, and people just feeling so tired and just not able to sympathize or empathize, with people. And I
Yes.
just think that that is a timely message.
Oh, and I just want them to, we all feel this way. We all get there of, I have to talk about this again, right? That's when we have to slow down and take care of ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's so good, Alyssa. Thank you for answering that question for us. And, it definitely is something that a lot of people are wondering, like, why am I experiencing this? What do I do about it? I feel like a horrible person or whatever it might be, letting that shame creep in. And so I think that that answer is so good. And there are just so many tips for managing compassion fatigue. And like you said, I've experienced it, you've experienced it. So
Yes.
many of us have, and especially in this past year, I think a lot of us have. Yeah. All right. Well, let's dive into our last segment of My Counselor Live, which is our Q&A portion, which is so fun. This is the part that you, the listeners, get to be a part of. We're answering your questions that you've sent in, and we're going to dive right in to our first question, which was sent in online at MyCounselor.Online/ask. This person said, would you say that some Christian practices and teachings from the Bible have potential to cause people trauma and some mental health problems, which ultimately damages their life and their faith?
Yes.
Heavy question.
Yes. So talking from my own experience of having, I would define it as spiritual abuse. This happens. And when you look at abuse of any kind or damage, right, with trauma and mental health, it's when somebody uses their authority in a way that goes against your rights, right? So if I look at Christian practices and teachings, are things being taught in a way that's in context? Is it being taught in a way that resembles God's character? Is it being taught in a way that elevates you and pushes you towards Jesus? Right? God said that our number one priority is to love God. And then the second commandment is love people. Is the way someone's treating you or the way that you are being taught getting in the way of those two things? And oftentimes, what this looks like is when somebody's authority is being misused. And this is where humanity comes in. Is I don't know any pastor that would ever want to be cruel to another human. However, our humanity gets in the way. And so knowing that this does happen, that teachings and principle and tradition are misused and misguided. A lot of scripture is taken out of context, especially when you look at marriage. But really leaning in, figure out your own theology, stand up for yourself, but also know who's healthy and who's not. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's like not necessarily the biblical teachings and what is in the Bible, but it's more the humanity's interpretation of it that really can cause a lot of, trauma and struggles with their mental health.
Yeah. And we see this a lot with, like, when I say authority, it can be husbands and wives, it can be your pastor, it can be somebody who's discipling you. And the way it's done is just a way that doesn't uplift you and push you towards Jesus and makes you actually love people more. And it's so hard because I think oftentimes what happens is then people start to see Jesus in the wrong way.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I would say that I have also experienced this um, within the church. I worked in ministry in churches for a long time and definitely saw the I guess cracks really in what people were saying, what people were teaching, what they were living out, what leadership was doing. Like you said, leaders using their authority and their power almost against you. And I definitely have experienced this, and I know that I'm not alone. I feel like more and more I'm seeing people who are coming out and saying, you know what, I was hurt by the church and it completely turned me away from being interested in it. And that's so heartbreaking because that is so not the heart of God. And so it's so heartbreaking. And I definitely appreciate the place that this question comes from, just of curiosity and really asking, is it the Bible that is doing that?
Yeah.
Because it's not. It is not God's word that's doing that. It's the human beings who are teaching it.
Yep. And in this, I want to talk a little bit about offense. I know these are our hot, like the quick questions, but being hurt is different than being offended. And so allow yourself to feel hurt, allow yourself to experience whatever emotion that comes up, but do it in a place that's safe and do it in a place where you are being built up and equipped. Oftentimes we seek out like people like I'll seek out somebody who has the same experience as me. It's just what people do. It's part of our social psychology. This is where I want to encourage our viewers. Find people who aren't offended just like you. Find people who can love on you, can help you heal, can allow you to hurt, right? Instead of coming to a place of being offended and leaving. And I'm talking from my own stuff here. So I'm preaching to myself here of, hey, Alyssa, get good discipleship, get good accountability. Because what happens then is I just going back to that scripture of the harvest is huge, the workers are few. There is a principality out there that doesn't want us to be a part of your church, who doesn't want us to love Jesus and know his character. So we need to find people who can show us and reflect it back to us, Jesus, and not allow us to stay in our own offense.
Yeah, no, that's such great practical advice in response to this question. So
It's hard.
I know it is hard. It is so hard. And I appreciate that advice. I think that that is a great tip for people who are maybe struggling with what they've experienced from the church or from teachers. And, Yeah, I think that that is really, really good. So, with that, we're going to hop into the next question, which came to us. And this person said, what's a fair fog? Does it have anything to do with false reconciliation? What is a person to do to break this cycle?
Ah, such a good question.
I know there are some good questions today. I'm feeling it.
I love our viewers. A fair fog. A fair fog is when a betrayed spouse or a betraying spouse is currently in a relationship that is extramarital. So, for example, if a husband is in the stereotypical and an affair with his secretary, right? A fair fog is when he sees everything through rose-colored glasses. Is that that person can give him everything that he's missing in his marriage, everything is great, everything is good. And then when he looks at his spouse, he just sees all the negatives, right? The dangerous part of a fair fog is that oftentimes when you're actively involved in an affair, you're not doing real life. You're not parenting. You're not talking about bills. You're not figuring out how to get rid of your debt. So a fair fog is such a confusing space for the betraying spouse because their needs feel like they're getting met with the affair partner. And they see their actual spouse, wife, or husband in such a negative way that it actually pulls them into the fog. It pulls them into this place, but I feel good here. This makes sense. Why don't I stay? And the hard part is it's just not reality. It doesn't last, right? That's why oftentimes when people marry their affair partners, those marriages don't last. So that's what a fair fog is. And then the connection with false reconciliation is when you have a betraying spouse who recommits to his wife or husband or whoever, right? Is that you recommit. You go through disclosure, you go through all of these things, but it's not truly out of a place of repentance, right? With affair and recovery, oftentimes there's a process that sin enters our lives. And in that process, we start making small compromises. And in secret, we'll make a decision that doesn't match what's in reality, right? So with a closed door, you might go watch pornography, but in reality, like in the daily life of what you show everybody, it doesn't match what you would actually do behind closed doors, right? So when you have a betraying spouse, and what we would say with that is kind of just lacking integrity, and we want to help heal that. We want you to match. We want that all of that to make sense for you. False reconciliation is when that partner is still trying to match. How they feel in secret matches how they feel sitting on the couch with their spouse. So false reconciliation, I think, is this really big process of it's not always super deceitful or intentional. So speaking to the betrayed spouses who might be in this spot that they feel like their spouse recommitted and it was a lie, your spouse is still trying to figure out how to match, to have integrity, to come to this place of honor that Christ calls him or her to be at. And so the question, I think, was how you break that cycle. I think the biggest part is really working in counseling. And I say that because we need accountability beyond our spouse so that there can be understanding about the affair fog of why did it feel so good to be in an affair? Why is it so hard to reconcile with a spouse when it doesn't always, it feels like the right decision, but it doesn't feel good? And working through that because we want to, the man behind the door or the wife behind the door needs to match the one sitting on the couch. And that's the process of healing that has to happen for a betraying spouse, right? I hope I said that right, Tori. I just want our viewers to know, like, there is so much kindness and so much love. And I will never give like, oh, it was a good thing that you cheated. I will never say that. But working on compassion for that person so that they can actually step into a place of looking at themselves so that they can start matching and then they can rebond with their spouse.
Yeah, no, that's so good. Alyssa, you are always just so wise and eloquent every time we get to talk. And it just amazes me how you just think on the fly, like all of these amazing things. But I think that that was really encouraging answer to this question. So with that, let's do the last question of our time here, which is, I feel so numb and disconnected right now. Am
Yes.
I depressed?
Yeah. Oh, such a good question. There's my next article, friends. Not necessarily, right? Depression, we can look at this in two ways. A clinical depression, which might be like the chemical imbalance in the brain with a lack of serotonin, dopamine, or norepinephrine, right? Which can create these feelings of numbness. So that may be happening, right? I think oftentimes there's a statistic that I heard that 80% of hospital visits, like emergency room visits, are somatic, which means that your emotions are creating physical symptomology. And so when I think about this, the depression, that felt depressedness, the felt disconnection and numbness might actually be a lot of emotion that hasn't been expressed. And what happens is you numb out. It's too hard to feel those things. It's too hard to connect with another human and be real. So we numb out. And that it's actually like a defense that most people aren't aware that they do. And oftentimes we actually build it as kids and then we grow up and then eventually we're like, oh, I probably don't need to numb out anymore. Maybe I'm depressed. Like it doesn't make sense. Why am I numb? It doesn't make sense. My life is good. And it might just be a lot of emotion that you don't want to feel, all building up until you numb out, which feels like depression. And it might not necessarily be.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good answer. That's a hard place to be in. Like that's confusing.
Yes. As I said that, I was like, that's so like psychobabbly, and I'm so sorry. But it is such a hard place to be in because you might actually think that there's something like psychologically wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it just requires so much time to like do an inventory of yourself. Because it's, I mean, you can ask me that question, you can ask you that question, but it's like really the only person that's going to be able to answer that is you, which feels a little bit overwhelming.
Yep. I know, friends, just so you guys know that I'm human, is this process that when I'm avoiding, I'm a napper. I love to nap. But if I'm napping a lot, there's times that I have to stop and ask myself, am I numbing out? Am I avoiding? What am I not wanting to feel? And it keeps me healthy, or else there's going to be times that I would end up in a depressed state or
Yeah.
anxiety. It could look like anxiety and not depression. Yeah.
Right, right. Just trying not to feel the weight of everything we're thinking of.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. No, that's so good. I love it. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for sending in those questions. We love getting to answer those. And you can always send us a private message on Instagram, on Facebook, or go to MyCounselor.Online/ask and submit your questions there. But we love this part of the segment, this part of the episode where we get to just talk through your questions and hear
Yep.
so much great wisdom from so many amazing counselors. So thank you, Alyssa, for that. And we're going to go ahead and end this week's episode of My Counselor Live. It has been such a pleasure, Alyssa, as always. I've had so much fun with you and feel like I always get counseled every time. And I'm like walking away like, wow, I just went through a counseling session.
Yeah. Well, I just love you. I love our viewers. And I just want them to know, keep sending in those questions. Yeah. We all want to help as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, you guys have a great week, and we'll see you next week for another episode of My Counselor Live with another of our amazing counselors. So we'll see you next time, guys.
Bye.